I'm Christopher Lydon, and this is Open Source, sorting puzzle pieces from the opening rounds of war with Iran. The U.S. and Israel started it. The supreme leader of the Islamic Republic in Iran was among the first to die in it on the first weekend of the war, which President Trump says could go on for weeks. But to what end? On whose say-so? At what risk? Hussein Banai, known as Huss, is our guest, the guide we turn to, partly because he was born and schooled in Iran. He is informed, but not official. He's professor of international studies at Indiana University in Bloomington. Huss, you call it a regime change war, but you say the regime that's changed is the American one, the Trump team. We'll get to all of that, but first, what do you hear from Iran?
By all intents and purposes, this looks like, the end stages of a familiar tyrannical regime. But we also should remind ourselves that it's not finished yet. As we speak, there is a commission that is deciding who the next supreme leader will be. The Iranian constitution has very specific procedures for what that process looks like. So there will be, at a very kind of official level, the formality of kind of recognizing a new leadership structure. This is not Iraq. This is not Libya. This is not Syria. No one has fled, and a kind of a very rigid top-down system has not collapsed. This is a very diffuse, multi-layered regime. The domestic aspect of this, I think, is in many respects the most important. In February, the regime celebrated its 47th anniversary after the revolution. Over the course of the last 5 years, this regime has absorbed a set of blows to its economy, to its ecology, to its civil society in ways that, frankly, it had not all the way up to that point. The trigger for this was October 7th, Hamas attack on Israel, because it started to kind of really highlight the extent to which the Islamic Republic had misspent so many resources on proxy groups and Shia organizations in other parts of the country when its own economy was suffering. And obviously the domestic protests in 2022 after the killing of Mahsa Amini, the Kurdish girl who was visiting the capital and was beaten by morality police because her headscarf wasn't quite right, started the beginnings of a mass movement domestically. And successive rounds of protests really rattled the regime to a point where it finally gave up actually enforcing the hijab entirely. And I was seeing, videos and pictures of women and girls not wearing the hijab anymore as they were walking on the streets. Music was being played, very freely. All indications were that the regime was telling the people, you can breathe as long as you let us kind of deal with the foreign crisis facing us. All of that came to a head when Iran's currency collapsed in December. And the merchant shops, the Bazari class, started going on strikes. And then that spread to universities and student organizations, and then eventually to the order that Khamenei, the supreme leader, gave to quash the domestic disturbance by any means necessary, which some reports say between 15,000 to 30,000 Iranians were massacred in the span of 2 days on the streets. So the crisis of domestic legitimacy here was a big part of the picture. People are done with this regime, and they were desperate for anyone who promised that they would overthrow them to sort of say, okay, we won't rise in support of this. So to the extent that we don't see Iranians, ordinary Iranians, rushing to support this regime, and it has to draw on like the most hardened, loyal supporters, I think it has to do with that broader domestic set of crises that really bubbled up just prior to this military campaign being announced.
Speaking of your own family and friends in Iran, Huss, what does the family want?
A better tomorrow. I know that's very cliche to say. A relief from this regime maybe is the best that they can kind of hope for in the short term. I have cousins in Iran. I have uncles and aunts still living there. Some are dual citizens and they go back and forth, but most of them are there right now. And communications have been cut down, so haven't been able to really establish any direct lines with anyone to see if they're doing well or not. But you get messages over social media that they're okay here and there after internet gets restored or they find an area where they can, connect to Starlink. But overwhelming anxiety with where things are headed, jubilation, I should say, at the news of supreme leader being targeted and eliminated. Many Iranians, and my family's not really alone in this, believe that this supreme leader in particular exercised such direct power and brought and invited so much misery simply out of his own sense of obduracy and arrogance, frankly, that him being gone, perhaps, even if it's not, the regime is not fully displaced, there would be more room for pragmatism and compromise going forward. So that's the overall sense I get.
We never feel we're getting the straight story in the papers, except from you, Huss. You speak of a monstrous regime being undone here by a monstrous intervention. How do we understand it?
Well, I think the first place to begin is that this is the first major war of a new regime in Washington. We cannot look at this, and I think the temptation to go back and look at analogs in Iraq and Afghanistan are fairly understandable. A lot of experts are doing it. If you listen to anything that's coming out of Washington think tanks or the national, international commentariat at mainstream news organizations, be there papers or cable news networks, you're getting a lot of those comparisons that this is a kind of a similar version of the Iraq War, albeit without an ideology of neoconservatism behind it, or that, the echoes of Vietnam, given that there's a great power rivalry in the background with China, et cetera. And I really think we need to kind of dispense with those frameworks, because the starting point for looking at this conflict in its own right is Donald Trump and his very remarkably incoherent position in terms of what he wants out of Iran and what he wants for the future of Iran. He's never really articulated these two perspectives in any clear way, and he's been all over each sides of this argument. So we have on Saturday morning, when he announces the start of major combat operations, him saying that this is not only a war to deal with Iran's nuclear program, which only 8 months earlier he had declared obliterated, set aside that contradiction, but that the talks have broken down. Iran is being very obdurate with its nuclear program, and so we need to go and take care of business. But then in the same breath, he says, we're going to undertake regime change. We're going to collapse this government. And Iranians, it's going to be your country, and you decide what you want next. So we get immediately regime change on top of supposedly a war for deterrence purposes, to basically reestablish some sort of deterrence against Iran's menacing nuclear program, supposedly. Already you have two vastly different objectives, and he's speaking on all sides of this. But I think if you kind of take a step back and say, why is it that the president of the United States is articulating the aims of such a major military operation in such an incoherent, contradictory fashion, you immediately start thinking about, well, what he's been doing ever since his return to office has been a kind of broadening, entrenching his particular group of elite networks of patronage, whatever you want to call them, foothold in Washington, D.C., inside American politics first, and now beyond that globally as well. And here, the campaign in Venezuela, as a prelude to what's happened here, also figures very strongly. A lot of people have pointed out that, maybe he wants something similar in Venezuela, in Iran, albeit the two are vastly different countries, geographies, and would require different American levels of commitment. I would say that the major framework through which we need to look at is this is a major foreign policy move on behalf of a new political regime in Washington, D.C. It does not map on very easily onto American great power interests as they have been since the end of the Second World War. It does not map onto a ideological project such as neoconservatism or liberal idealism, or even a kind of a version of a neo-feudalist, mercantilist strategic framework.
We've gotten used to regime change, but you're saying something different. Something has inflicted a regime change on us, on Washington, on American policy in the world. Spell that out.
Yeah, well, the Republican Party all but has collapsed and turned into a cult of personality, whatever you want to call it, a full devotion to one man, his family, and the networks of commercial interests around him. The individuals who understood this most clearly were those tech CEOs that stood behind him on the dais on the day of his inauguration in January 2025. From then on, one corporate leader after another has kind of fallen in line as well. We've had, with his capture of a major political party inside the United States, the collapse of congressional checks and balances because that party controls both houses of Congress. And we've had a very pliant Supreme Court that has more or less tried to accommodate him, albeit giving him little red lines here and there. So the project of consolidating his commercial financial interests domestically is very much underway. How this has been translating into foreign policy, we've also seen from the beginning the kind of declarations of possible invasion of the Panama Canal, of Greenland, of Canada becoming a 51st state. Once again, telling the Europeans that they're supposed to either pay up or shut up, and his kind of lackadaisical, disinterested way almost in which he has dipped in and out of the Ukraine war. I think you have that new regime with that domestic and foreign set of interests really now trying to conduct kind of a national security strategy that aligns very closely to the interests and pockets of those within it.
Put it in the context of the almost indescribable tension with China. Add Iran to Venezuela, not to mention our long, close alliance with the Saudi oil suppliers. We have something like a global monopoly now in the supply of the world's dominant energy source. And China has to be thinking, wait a sec, we thought we had an inside track with Iran, but now the United States is running that. How does this play, and how can China and Russia, for that matter, not want to hit back somehow?
There's a conventional and an unconventional answer to this picture. The conventional answer is that the so-called liberal international order has completely collapsed, as Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney announced formally its death at the Davos meeting earlier this year. And in that picture, really, the world of kind of complex interdependence, commercial interests between American firms and European and Asian firms, all of that has now gone by the wayside. And you have a kind of a pay to play, hard power politics replacing it. And in this picture, Donald Trump is really interested in fortifying major resources, be they oil, be they rare earth minerals, etc., into not only the American camp, but also his own pockets as well, advancing the interests of people who are most closely aligned with him. And this is not conspiratorial, by the way. The New York Times, the Washington Post, they've all kind of been tracking how the thirst for these resource grabs are so closely aligned to companies and firms close to the circle around the Trump administration. That conventional explanation of basically the liberal, world of semi-rules-based system, as Mark Carney said, has all but gone to the wayside. Now everyone's kind of for themselves. The unconventional explanation, which I think is with Trump, you always have to keep front and center because he defies conventional analysis in so many ways, has to do with his personal psychology, as well as his commercial interests. I think this would be a lot easier to maneuver if it was just, naked commercial interests and financial interests. But I think there's a psychological element here, which is Trump does not so much care about enhancing his financial position so much as he is about his status, his brand, his grand historical presence on the world stage, and dominating the news cycle almost on a second to second basis. He cannot stand it. It was actually very telling when Mark Carney gave that speech at Davos. Trump was mostly upset because it got so much echo. He almost never addressed the substance of what he had raised at Davos, that, no, what are you talking about? The United States wants to work with Europeans. I said, no, he was just upset that Carney was getting so much positive press for saying what he said. That thirst for domination of attention is something that continually, I think he's searching for. He wants to be the headline. I think a lot of these issues see them come and go. Greenland, he puts it out there. Everyone talks about it for, week and a half. And then, the Carney speech comes, it goes away. Then he finds another thing, blows it up. He is a master of focusing global attention on himself. And I think anytime he gets close to, being marginalized, he would want to kind of bring that camera and that microphone just in front of him as well. And I think that unconventional analysis on top of the conventional analysis really explains where we might be in this global picture when you put China, Russia, and the domestic regime change in the United States as well.
Conventional or unconventional, Huss, deal with the more than the suspicion that this is Israel's war, that Bibi Netanyahu has Donald Trump under his thumb, that the war against Iran is in the classic Bibi succession of states that Israel doesn't trust, Iran more than any of them, and bigger and more powerful than almost any of those Israel's neighbors. Whose war is this, actually?
Yeah, this is a fascinating question to me because we're now seeing, in many respects, the kind of direct collision of Israeli interests with the interests that I just described. For a very long time, since the founding of the State of Israel, Israeli interests have been very complementary to either the liberal idealist version of American foreign policy or the neoconservative version of American foreign policy. It's been bipartisan, supported by both political parties. And Donald Trump, although he has heavily courted pro-Israel voters and foreign policy hawks in his campaign for president, when you look at his resume when he is in office, he is not shy in kind of overlooking or setting aside, especially Bibi Netanyahu's version of what he wants out of this war. Step back and look at the June war. It's very clear that the Israelis would have very much liked to have finished the Iranian regime right then and there. The element of surprise was there. They finally got the United States to commit military resources to it with the B-2 bombers, hit the nuclear sites, but then go after the leadership. And that campaign was very much underway. And then Trump arbitrarily, abruptly, just pulls back after 12 days and even uses expletives to basically tell Bibi Netanyahu, you need to agree to a ceasefire right then and there. So they must be looking at this second round as a kind of a really wasted 8 months because Iran has been able to replenish its resources, but also to set in place structures now that could really outlast the first round of bombing of or elimination of Iran's leadership. So you have Israeli interest on a kind of a very thin razor blade here, because if Trump decides that he basically wants to a version of Venezuela with Iran, which is get rid of the top leadership that were insisting on, clinging on to some sort of nuclear program or their missile program, but strike a deal with basically a rebranded version of Islamic Republic made up of Revolutionary Guard commanders that have, would be very happy to buy American arms or sign oil deals with Donald Trump. He could settle for a deal like that. That regime is still very anti-Israel, and it would not serve Bibi's needs or interests in terms of replacing the regime with someone like Reza Pahlavi, the son of the former Shah, who's very closely aligned with Israel in this picture. So that, if you will, alliance is really on the line depending on which direction Trump would go. And given that the United States is not committing troops on the ground, even when the U.S. planned very carefully, committed troops on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan, neither one of those projects turned into what the American war planners had designed in terms of resulting in a government that was friendly or a Jeffersonian democracy or what have you. And that's not even the picture here. So we're almost certainly ending up with a type of government in Iran that's going to be at odds with Israel's long-term interests.
The other succession or repetition that we look for in this zone by habit now is between tragedy and farce. People are talking about reinstalling the Pahlavi regime, the Shah. It seems utterly unbelievable. The old Shah, my kind of Shah, as Dave Powers said in the Kennedy White House, he was thrown out by the Islamic Republic. There's now talk of bringing his son back. Would be acceptable to the United States. But could Iran possibly accept this?
To be fair to Reza Pahlavi, the crown prince in exile, he keeps saying that long interview with 60 Minutes last night, and he repeated this, that he only wants to be a transitional figure. The restoration of monarchy is not something he's seeking. He wants to be a transitional person that helps the next Iranian government that will be democratic, bound by a constitution that respects civil rights and rights of minorities in place of the Islamic Republic. He's not any Ahmed Chalabi trying to kind of persuade the Trump administration to go back and be exile leader on deal one. Now that's what he says, and we should take him at his word. His supporters are an entirely different bunch. They eagerly seek the return of monarchy and constitutional monarchy to Iran again. And obviously that's an alternative that has to play itself out. But I think in terms of planning for the future of Iran, what's remarkable to me is how disconnected the Pahlavi team seems to be from the Trump administration. To the best of my knowledge, Trump has rebuffed meeting with them in person. He's not interested in cultivating, a government in exile going back. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that Trump fundamentally believes that it would take a long time for him to go back and rebuild those commercial interests to a level that then perhaps he could take advantage of. Trump could be able to take advantage of. So he sees him as not really having deep roots. He said of him that he's a nice man, but I'm not sure how much support he has back home. That's very telling, that I think he much rather work with someone who's in charge now rather than wait for someone to take charge.
But that sounds like somebody out of the present regime, including the Revolutionary Guards, no?
Exactly. And I mean, this is where the Venezuela comparison becomes very interesting. They extract Maduro, bring him to New York. The rest of the regime is left untouched and, is rebranding itself very slowly as having a much more of a soft-handed way of dealing with opposition, perhaps, maybe, who knows. But what's unmistakable, and Trump has said this after the Venezuela extraction operation, is that the oil is ours, that our companies will now get the bids. And it seemed to be that all he wanted out of Venezuela.
He's saying we're handing the country over to you, Iran, but he seems to be speaking to the people who've been in the streets against the Islamic Republic in the last many months, right?
He is rhetorically saying that. There's no question about it, that your government is disliked and you should take over. But obviously that's very vague. How that actually plays out, who knows what it will be. But also there's no organized opposition from inside Iran. The reformists swear loyalty to the Islamic Republic Constitution. They're technically part of the regime. There's no kind of anti-system organized opposition inside the country. And Trump is very well known for, saying one thing and then reversing himself 2 hours later. So I can see him sort of be like, oh, I'm happy with the emerging kind of Revolutionary Guards, Islamic Republic 2.0, that doesn't have a cleric who just shouts, death to America all day, but, guarantees that there will be energy contracts or what have you.
Don't we have to be waiting, Huss Banai, to hear from China and Russia about whether any of this is acceptable to the other great powers in the world?
Yeah, I mean, that is the big question here. I think more and more, the way I consider, I'm not a China expert, but I've studied China's strategic partnership with Iran, which has never amounted to much. It's basically an oil for barter program. So they take Iranian oil and flood the Iranian market with cheap electronics and bad construction equipment, which the public has really been outraged by. The Chinese the amount of strategic patience they're demonstrating here is remarkable and very telling. I think they're seeing just how quickly the structure of not only the liberal rules-based system has collapsed, but how quickly this new regime is alienating many of the alliances that, frankly, they had thought they would have to work hard to undo. So why not sit back and let it all collapse onto its own? I mean, heck, we might not be that far from a time when Taiwan begs to be taken in by China. Why? Because ultimately, what is so dear to Taiwanese residents is a liberal democratic constitution. The whole reason they've been part of the U.S. security umbrella. It's not because they produce chips. It's because they had a representative form of government, a kind of a Bill of Rights domestically, et cetera. And if the United States doesn't care about that anymore, and in fact, it's cultivating authoritarian far right governments and regimes from Venezuela to Iran to Syria, don't forget that, the former Al Qaeda man being a handsome looking guy to Trump in charge of Syria. If these are the kinds of regimes that the United States is now cultivating, why should Taiwan look to the United States to safeguard its democracy?
Is anybody getting really what they hoped for here? Did anybody anticipate the day after the bombs fell?
No, I don't think so. I think the US war planners obviously would be happy with what they've accomplished. The military generals have an objective to go and pacify Iranian defenses and neutralize its nuclear program. And, American air superiority was never in question or doubt, especially when combined with Israeli air power. So they're accomplishing their goals at that level. But in terms of the political objectives, their strategic objectives, I don't think anyone knows how this will serve America's interests in the medium to long term. The Iranian government played with fire and found out they're going to be weakened more as a result of this. There's no question. They're going to be the party that loses most, perhaps only after next to the Iranian public, which is going to have to absorb all the misery from all sides. The Arab countries are getting hit. Their oil installations, Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, Qatar, UAE, they're all in the crosshairs of this war. There's damage to buildings, to civilian infrastructure, to oil refineries. And the Israelis are unsure whether they're going to end up with a government that is friendly to Israel or if it's going to be a kind of a rebranded, much more security-oriented state, similar to maybe Pakistan, but still very anti-Israel, meaning the generals are in charge in the background and there's a civilian kind of figurehead in charge. So no, there is incoherence all around. And frankly, this is part and parcel of the Trump regime, right? At home. I mean, when you look around, you're like, are there interests being served inside the United States with, the immigration policies, with the tariff policy, with what they're doing with, higher education or NIH or, CDC, et cetera? It's chaos everywhere. It's unclear whose interests are being served or, what the long-term picture will look like. I think we're getting a kind of a foreign analog of this in these wars of choice that this administration has launched.
We're warned continually, every day, that there's always a danger of World War III, a much wider global conflict emerging out of almost anything. Where is the real danger of World War III hiding in this chaotic picture?
In unpredictability and uncertainty. As you know, I'm a professor of international relations. I teach two courses that look at the causes of the First and Second World War. And when you go back and you look at the histories of the outbreak of those two wars, there are coherent narratives in a linear fashion moving towards why the war broke out or provide an explanation retrospectively. But at the time, when people were living those daily lives, in the case of the First World War, they were sleepwalking into it without even knowing it because of how much uncertainty there was around them. They could not look at the variables clearly enough, as opposed to us who can look at it from a centuries long perspective and be able to put the variables together. Same with the Second World War. The collapse of the League of Nations, the punishing terms of the settlement at Versailles on Germany, et cetera. Who would have thought that they would kind of little by little trickle into the collapse of Weimar Germany or rise of ethnic tensions and nationalist sentiments on Europe again, right? At the time, people living those moments didn't think that those things would be the natural endpoint, but what they did see was uncertainty, unpredictability, and the kind of psychologies, frankly, that we see around today. Men with kind of grand view of themselves in history, thinking that they're going to be remembered as the saviors, aggrandizers of their nations, to hell with everyone else that came before them.
Not to mention imperial pretensions, sense of natural-born destiny to rule the world. There's too much of that rolling around the decks for my taste.
Exactly. I mean, I think empire, when you break down the logic of empire, is the impulse to control arbitrarily other people, other geographies. right? Impose your will on them. Do what you think is best for them, and not let them tell you what's good for them themselves. And I think that impulse is all around us. I mean, in this war, obviously, in a very visceral way, Donald Trump, who probably has spent, I don't know, maximum of 30 minutes looking at any kind of sophisticated briefing book on Iran's power structure just over the course of the last 40 years, deciding what's best for Iran and Iranians going into the future. Vladimir Putin with Ukraine, and obviously Xi Jinping having grand imperial pretensions as well. So yeah, that factor is very much part of the picture too.
Huss Banai, you bring a kind of human clarity and modesty and reality to this whole impossible subject. I can never thank you enough for being our friend and our help.
Thank you so much, Chris. I can only say to that I've had a very good education and very good teacher in you and your program over the years. So thank you for shaping my imagination in a way that can perhaps speak to some of my expertise in more creative ways today.
Hussein Banai is professor of international studies at Indiana University in Bloomington. Among his books recently was Republics of Myth, National Narratives in the U.S.-Iran Conflict. Here at Open Source, we count on listener support. If you haven't done your part yet, please go now to radioopensource.org/donate and pitch in to keep the world's first and longest-running podcast going strong. We are proud to be a founding member of Hub and Spoke, a Boston-based collective of independent voices in podcasting. Check the range of our interests, from art to technology to history and politics, at hubspokeaudio.org. You'll be glad you did. And thank you